Now entering the Bitcoin Podcast Network.
This episode is brought to you by Shapeshift.io, the easiest, fastest, and most secure way to swap your digital assets. Don't run the risk of leaving your funds on a centralized exchange. Visit Shapeshift.io to get started today. And this episode is also sponsored by my patrons on Patreon. We got about 40 at about $700 a month, and so I like to give different examples each episode for why they support. And here's why German likes the show. He says, if the nicest person in the world had to be assigned a voice, it would have to be Rhys's. Cool. And so today is my first live interview that I post on the podcast. It's with Ryan Martens, who's the co-founder and CTO of Rally Technologies, which sold for $480 million in 2015. And post-exit, Ryan's been working on building the emergent future, especially around climate change, with this thing called ImpactHub. So I asked him a bit about that, and we also spend a lot of the time with him asking me questions about how I see the emergent future. So I talk about ETHCommons and GameB and complex system dynamics and kind of big system change. So with that, I hope you enjoyed the episode. Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Creating a Humanist Blockchain Future, where we take a systems thinking approach to doing good in the world. And today, this is a live podcast interview. And today, we have Ryan Martens here. And Ryan is the co-founder and CTO of Rally Technologies, which actually sold for $480 million, which is a lot of money, in 2015. And he's also very interested in the emergent future and is specifically working with this Communities for Change initiative, which we'll dive into in a bit. So, Ryan, thank you for being here.
Rhys, really excited to be here. We'll talk a little bit about what brought me here, but it's neat to bring your community together with the one that we're working on here in the Boulder area.
Yeah,
so, thanks.
That's good.
Yeah.
And just as a note, what we're going to do today is we're going to do, usually I just interview the person, but today we're going to do a little bit of cross-interviewing stuff where I'm going to start by interviewing Ryan about the work he's doing, and then we'll spend the most time with him interviewing me about the work that I'm doing. And then there'll also be time at the end for Q&A. So with that, let's dive into Ryan's stuff. Sure. I'm going to get in interview mode. So Ryan, what is... So you're leading this initiative. It's with the ImpactHub. It's with this Communities for Change thing. And it's also using, I think let's start though with this TheoryU thing. And so TheoryU, could you tell us about what is TheoryU?
Sure, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So it's a method created for humans, specifically a change method. And the thinking behind it was, how would you create a method that would allow people to create the future that they want, not work from the past. So not increment from the past, but envision and feel what's emerging in the future and lead from the emerging future. That's one of the subtitles of what it is. We've tried a lot of ways to implement change. There's all kinds of change methods that come around in the world, whether you work from rationales or you work from where's the energy coming from in the system. But this one's really different. It's created by the Presencing Institute, which is a group out of MIT led by Otto Scharmer, which is tied to the systems thinking work that was done at MIT's Sloan School for years with Danella Meadows and others. Mm-hmm. And basically we're following a path of following this shape of a U, as they describe it, of initially starting with sensing, where are we at right now, then trying to presence and understand really what's actually emerging, then trying to work as a team to crystallize those things, and then we're going to prototype those. We'll actually move on and take the prototypes out of this process, iterate on them more at the ImpactHub, and present them at Boulder Startup Week, with the specific goal in the case of our work to work in the area of climate and climate impact and resiliency.
Cool. I like it. And the thing that I specifically like about this is that when you're trying to determine this new future, a really good way to do so is to make sure that you're using the correct process to do so. And with this one, with TheoryU, it has this very blank slate feeling at the beginning, where you start with questions and you start with questioning, and you say, hey, not how things are today, but rather what is the future that we want to make, and then pulling us towards that. So I'm a big fan of that mind.
Yeah, it's been really effective. I've worked in this area for probably 20 years with people from MIT and systems thinking. I've seen many of the tools, but have never put it together as a complete process. There's a lot of resources available online, either tied to Otto Scharmer, TheoryU, the Presencing Institute, both books and PDFs, but there's also an edX course. And that's really how the ImpactHub got involved in all this, is that they ran giant MOOCs of classes out of MIT around this concept, and those things have a large drop-off rate. And at the end of the drop-off, a majority of the people that were left doing the course were at hubs all around the world. So the BMW Foundation sponsored this with the Impact Hubs to sponsor 6 cities across the world right now. And so we're going through this process together with Harare, Budapest, Shanghai, Baltimore, and Seattle, all working on what they call a big umbrella of inclusive cities.
Got it. And that's what this Communities for Change thing is. It's a multi-city thing where everybody's trying to make change within their city using this TheoryU system. And are all of them, I know that the one that you're involved with primarily, and the one for today is around climate change, resiliency. Are all of the current ones with that?
No, the broad umbrella of inclusive cities was the context of it. We did some meetups that we shared Zoom calls with people all around the world and went into little breakout rooms. So I actually talked to the folks from Baltimore. They're specifically working on the problem of redlining, which is, if you don't know much about it, it's part of how we give loans in the United States and how we've created systemic racism and segregation by redlining communities and saying you could not get loans in those communities. So that left African-American families in an ability not to be able to buy homes, and they had to rent and therefore not create equity in their home. So that's what Baltimore is going at. They were actually the folks who started that process in the 1930s, and the team in Baltimore is fired up about trying to fix it.
So different people are working on different things, and it's city by city. Cool. And then for the one today, this is part of what you call a learning journey.
Exactly.
So tell me, if TheoryU is the kind of underpinning framework for the methodology for how you're trying to create good change in the world by pulling towards the future, how does a learning journey fit in with that?
So we're instructed to go out, and we were taught a number of techniques, especially around listening and trying to get down to a place where not only do you acknowledge the things that you're always listening for that confirm your biases, but those things that don't confirm your biases, as well as the emotional part of what's actually happening in you and when you go on these journeys. And so we're doing some work with B-cycles, with EcoCycle around what composting and zero waste of the future looks like. And this one's primarily around, the enabling technology of blockchain, and what's that causing to emerge in the world? How can we sense into what that is, and how can we share that with the high school students that are in our class, as well as the folks from the Latino community, as well as people who are chief sustainability officers?
Yep, so a wide range of people, and bringing them from kind of a blank slate perspective towards what this thing could look like. Okay, interesting. And I feel like a learning journey is helpful, especially as we did at the beginning with the kind of context that we're talking about, where it can be you kind of that confirmation bias, that ability to say, hey, this is the way that things are and have been. The learning journey, in theory, pushes you outside of that.
Correct.
Cool.
And mostly we're supposed to, when they hear this podcast back, it'll be a chance for them to sense into what is it that they're hearing from all this, and what is it how does that feel like it's emerging? The goals were to first open your mind, then open your heart, and then open your will to the change that's emerging. So those are things we've been trying to practice as a group. We've done a whole bunch. We have a set of facilitators at the ImpactHub in Boulder that are leading us through it, as well as then global faculty from the MIT campus that are broadcasting weekly homeworks that we have to do. So it's been pretty intense. We're at week 5 or 6 right now.
Week 6 of 7.
Of 8.
Of 8, okay,
Yeah.
okay.
And we take a week off for spring break next week, and there's a few more learning journeys before we get through the end of this. Yeah.
I think that's something that we're unlikely to talk too much about today, or we might, but I want to insert it now, is this ability to did you call it a free will, or what did you call it?
First was free your mind,
exactly.
then free your heart, then free your will.
Yeah.
But you've those are steps.
Yes, it's in that order. And I think that that's something that's, I think, crucial with all of this, is that it all starts with you. That you have to, if you are not secure yourself, or if you have issues with your ability to free your mind and to rationally listen to people, or if you have issues with like making commitments, thing or whatever, you're not going to be able to do much, so you kind of got to start with yourself, and then once you start with yourself, then you can address the world.
Absolutely. All the homework is directed at us individually. So first we work on ourselves, and then we come together every week and work as a group, but only after we've done some work on ourselves.
Yep, yes. Self-work for the win. Cool, that makes sense. I don't think I have any other questions for context. Do you have anything else that you want to say?
No, we can pick some things up in Q&A too if I missed something, but I covered everything I wanted to cover. I think it gives you good context now from where I'm going to come to interview you.
Yeah, exactly. Ooh, we're turning the tables. Okay.
So, as I said, this is of a wide variety of folks from all different backgrounds and different ages and experiences that are trying to really understand what's the implication of this technology on the future. What can we sense into? So this notion of a humanistic future and actively creating it is one that certainly captures my ear, but I think everybody in the group, as we try to understand, why is it every day that we wake up and by the end of the day we've figured out how to pollute the planet that we live in. We've figured out how to widen the equity gap in what we're doing with no intention of our own, right? That none of us wake up wanting to do that, but what do we do every day, right? And so how is it that we could create a more humanistic or sustainable future? And for you, how do you see this emerging?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so, well, on the point that you just stated there, that is this idea that we are all essentially individual actors within essentially an incentive set system, and as a result of that incentive set system, bad things can start to occur. So that's where it's like, oh, we didn't try to make this, but the system made it happen. And so what's emerging is essentially a way to exit our current system through essentially democratizing the incentive creation process. So if you imagine that we have a bunch of incentive creation processes that exist today, blockchain, and we can talk about more of this later once we get more of the context, gives us a cheaper way to create new incentive systems that will allow us to hopefully exit our current system and create a new, better system that is more equitable and sustainable and things like that.
I assume in addition to being cheaper, it's also maybe more accessible or user generated, as opposed to I need the super user person with root access to the computer and somebody at Google to go fix this for me. That's not what you're talking about.
No, yeah, and that's what I generally mean by democratization, is that it is either cheaper, easier, all those things. Hopefully we'll make it so that more people can do incentive creation. But I think it is worth saying before we talk about that, kind of this emergent future is based in the current, present, and our past. And so when we think about the past, let's start with the past and then go to the present and then talk a little bit about the future. So the past, if you look at the last 200 years, the last 200 years have been, there are these awesome 6 graphs that go across these different metrics, and you look at them and it's like, oh my God, 200 years ago, things were worse. 10% of people had basic education, 10% of people had a good ability to read. Almost everybody was in extreme poverty. No one was vaccinated. Half of kids died before the age of 5. Like, just a big, long list of sad things. And if you look at all of those metrics today, you're like, oh, well, now 90% of people, they've all flipped, essentially. 90% of people are out of extreme poverty. Almost everybody has a basic education, can read. Almost everybody's vaccinated. Most people are in democracies. Almost no kids die before the age of 5. Right. It's a better world than it was.
For humans.
What's up?
For the humans.
For humans. And clearly, the externality of all that was that we have So that is all to say that we are starting to enter this world where all of the metrics that we've been tracking, we're like, oh, we're starting to do well on them. And we're entering this world of abundance or having enough. And so another way to think about this is from the macro view, we're starting to reach 100% on all of those kind of metrics, but also at the micro view, like for me personally, I'm about to self-tax myself a couple $1,000 because after you make about $4,000 a month, you just stop getting happier when you get more money. So it's like, oh, I have enough. It's not going to make me happier. I can make the world happier with this money. So that is the first key piece here, is that we exist in this strange world, post-industrial revolution, where a bunch of metrics have gone up and to the right exponentially, and we're starting to get to the place where we have enough/abundance.
I think of a lot of people when we talk about the industrial revolution and that cycle is we're hugely focused on efficiency and at the cost of maybe other metrics that might come to you. A couple come to my mouth, but
we were optimizing for some metrics and ignoring the other metrics.
Correct.
So, but for those metrics we were optimizing for, things have been okay.
maybe not a very balanced scorecard, but highly optimized on efficiency.
Yes, definitely. And so now, given our present state, now we're essentially about to, if the Industrial Revolution started, it was like that last 200 years, the current revolution is this new digital internet revolution. And that one is one where we're essentially going to start experiencing massive, converging, exponential, accelerating technological change, which is a lot of intense words all put together, but I think all of them are pretty much true. And the reason for that is because we're about to have 4 billion people with smartphones in the world, and all those people with smartphones, because of the way the internet works, we'll be able to learn a lot more quickly. We'll be able to then create value more quickly and then distribute that value more quickly. If you make an app, it can go anywhere in the world. And so that quick value creation engine is generally a good thing because we will be creating more and more value. But that also means that we're creating these parallel value across so many different sectors, whether it's biotech and CRISPR or AI and robotics or crypto and blockchain or AR and VR. All of these things are going to be happening and are happening in an intense way. And as all of those things happen, we need to make sure that essentially what we did for the Industrial Revolution, which was ignore our externalities and ignore climate change, and now we're like, we need to deal with that. If we do that same thing, but also do it for all of these converging massive exponential trends, we are likely to self-terminate, is the way to think about it, because essentially the externalities that we're ignoring from all those different things, we will be in a crazy system where everything is changing super rapidly, and we're ignoring the externalities, and then we have a sad state. So this is to say that those past 200 years from the Industrial Revolution, plus the current state with the digital revolution and this upcoming, the value loops being much quicker and the massive converging exponential change, that means that we likely need to start thinking in this GameB reality where we have where we're starting to incorporate externalities, where we're starting to be omni-considerate, where we start to kind of change the way that we play the game.
Makes sense. Yeah. Sometimes when I talk to others about it, it's the difference between efficiency and effectiveness, right? What we really need to be effective at is well-being, is at happiness, is those kinds of indicators, as well as maybe biodiversity, species creation instead of destruction, and overall water and air health, right? Those are the things that keep our planet going. Yep. That maybe be a bigger balanced scorecard for us.
Well, I think that there's the climate perspective, which is super strong, and then there's also the other perspectives, which are, as we need to worry about the climate one, we also should be worried about like artificial intelligence risk, and we should probably be worried about nuclear security risk and biosecurity risk. So there's a bunch of things like that where it's like, yeah, the scorecard needs to be very balanced.
So I feel angst. Mm-hmm. I'm not quite sure. I feel like you've made me feel any better.
Okay, totally.
With all of the convergence of all those technologies at once. And I remember the guys from Sun talking, Bill Joy talking about really trying to regulate nanotechnology, right? It was again, not knowing how that technology was going to deploy itself. We haven't really had any big issues associated with it yet, but now you can combine these things with a couple other things, and I can create some worst case scenarios. When I think about transitioning, I always think about letting go and then the phase of transitioning and the one of starting anew. That's typically how it. Do those words cause you to think of anything? What are we going to be letting go of?
Yeah. So there's a couple pieces there. I think that when I hear letting go, transitioning and starting anew, that also maps onto another system perspective where you think about the kind of protective things we need to do within GameB, and that's kind of a little bit with the letting go piece. That's the transitionary work that we need to do from GameA to GameB, and then finally the starting a new piece, which is the post-transitionary work within GameB. So that's kind of how I map it into. The things that I think we need to let go of are the biggest one for me, honestly, and the one that I think is the key leverage point here is this accumulation mindset. And that's the one that I am actively trying to push with this. Hey, we have enough. We live in a world of abundance. You don't even get happier. It's like, why are you doing it? Well, because we've been taught in various ways. So I think that if we are able to create that world of non-accumulation, then that creates non-scarcity mindsets, then that creates win-win situations, and that starts to lead to more kind of access economy, sharing economy style things, where people are starting to play more win-win games instead of win-lose games.
Yeah, I know I was well involved with the Pledge 1% concept, and there's a lot of people who have talked about this notion of the programming that we have in our heads of we spend our 20s and 30s learning, we spend our 30s and 40s earning, and we spend our 60s and 70s and 80s returning. And really Pledge 1% was directly aiming at that thing that says, why do you wait? What is it that you're waiting till your 60s to do? Why? There's no reason not to give 1% of your company when you're a new entrepreneur to set it aside to the community that helped you get it going.
Exactly.
Right? And you can start giving day one.
Yes, and this is actually a key point, and it is so one way to think about what we're trying to do is we're trying to play what we call an infinite game, and that's a game that you play just for the sake of playing rather than to win at the end. Because remember, if we try to win, then that's a win-lose dynamic, and the lose is a big lose, and then so it's a lose-lose dynamic. And so this infinite game, if you're trying to play that infinite game, you got to start at the beginning. And so for me, that's been kind of weird. Like I currently have about $20,000 to my name, and I'm about to self-tax myself about $4,000, $5,000 of that. And a lot of people would go, "You're stupid," And for me personally, I have been raised I've been saving my money for a ton of my life, or I've had the saver mindset, and I actually had this realization recently where I was like, oh man, does this non-accumulation mindset mean that I shouldn't save for retirement? And it's kind of is true, and it's kind of a reality in which if you, like when you imagine two realities, if I'm 65 and that's 40 years from now, what's the world going to look like? And it's super different if we take all this stuff to be true. And so if I save, then I will have been creating this bad accumulation mindset, and everybody else would have had it, and like, oh man, and then we're in this sad reality. But if I, and it's like if I, I'm trying to remember exactly what it is, but like it's kind of like a thing where it's like you have to choose. It seems dumb to do it, but if you, I guess here's the way to think about it. If capital is no longer scarce, that's a transition that's occurring right now, that's a world of abundance, then if you saved, you have something that no one cares about. And so that is kind of the mindset I'm trying to be in.
Well, and there's people that are clearly demonstrating that with other pledges that are giving away their billions and trying to use it now as opposed to setting up big private foundations that dribble out 5% of the earned capital every year, and they go on for generations and generations. It seems like now's the time to use that.
Now's the time.
Exactly.
Yep.
So I know from looking at your background that you grew up here in Denver. You got a computer science degree. You've taught English in India and Santa Fe. You were a CTO and engineer of a 2014 Techstars company in the space associated with music and technology. You're one of the co-founders of the Denver ETH community.
Yep, East Denver.
Including,
I'm not actually a co-founder, but I'm a
co-organizer.
Helper.
An organizer, at least for the hackathon that was a week ago.
Yes, definitely.
And 4 months ago, you became the co-steward of a thing called ETHCommons, which, as you quote on one of your sites, is an organization that's co-evolving the phase shift to crypto capitalism and a blockchain future, also known as GameB. Mm-hmm. From the talks I know, and from a little bit you've told me about GameB, which you might need to define, it seems very a very altruistic path. How did you get from that beginning to here? How did you get onto that?
So
where's the founding moment?
I think the crucial thing is that for me personally, I've always been kind of hyper optimized for, I'm both very intentional. I love operating at the kind of abstracted meta level and scale level. And I'm very curious. So as a result of those things, it's like, so when I was feeling, it was honestly kind of like some post-Trump stuff, where I was like, okay, this is happening and the world in various ways is doing crazy things. I don't think that I can work on my music education startup anymore because we don't have enough time. So I left with the desire to find what was next. And there's a very good system called effective altruism, which allows you to essentially prioritize how to do the most good in the world. And they use this neglectedness impact tractability framework where they say, hey, if you're thinking about a problem, how neglected is it? If a bunch of people are working on it, you might not need to. The second one is impact. If it's only going to affect like 10 people, it might not be that impactful. And then tractability is like solvability. So if you put some effort to it, can stuff actually happen? So using that kind of framework and mindset, they have this cause selection sheet.
And this is on the internet.
This is on the internet.
It's called, again, what was it, just to help?
Effective altruism, and then the cause selection sheet, if you go to 80,000 hours, you'll be able to find a bunch of good material there. Okay. And the key thing for me was actually what I'm doing, which is kind of this like complex system dynamics, kind of positively shaping crypto asset stuff. That's not actually very high up on their cause selection list. But if you look at a bunch of their problems, a lot of their problems, if you think about the why those problems exist, like nuclear security, biosecurity, climate change, AI risk, all of those are bad game theory problems. And so if you solve bad game theory problems, then you can solve all of those. And so why try to solve one when you can solve all? So that's essentially what I'm
Nice answer. Yeah, that's neat. I haven't heard you say that before. Yeah. Can you make some of this real for us and make it a little bit more concrete? I don't think we need to get into what is blockchain, and though you can, obviously there's some constructs that are maybe helpful to explain a little bit of, but what's emerging first from this space? What will we all know about maybe that would allow people to make it feel a little bit more concrete?
Yeah, well, I think we're gonna stay at one level of abstraction higher first, and then we'll talk about some concrete stuff. Great. I think that the one level of abstraction higher thing is this. When we think about this new future that we're trying to create, and some of you talked about this earlier, which was this idea of creating these new values for the future. So we're in this. When you conceptualize of the world, you should think of everything as a system. And when you're thinking things as systems, the main system that we exist in is what I call the tech society loop. So that's technology informs our reality in society, and then society, based off of that, then informs the technology we build. And so with that mindset, if you think about all the technology that's happening, we're saying, okay, we need to change, it's changing society, and in society, we need to start changing our values, our ideology, our art that we're making, those kinds of like ideas in order to then make sure that we change the technology as it goes forward. And so when we change that society, so that's one thing that I do in the space that we need to do is this, essentially you can call it like GameB evangelism, you could call it spreading these ideas, it's trying to change the ideology. And
the mindset.
The mindset, exactly, yep. The mindset. And that mindset is also, when you think about what we're trying to exit, a good way to think about what we're in now is like late stage capitalism. Sure. And there's even a really good subreddit on it, which is pretty funny. And capitalism, when Karl Marx talks about capitalism, he talks about his primary loop, which is what he calls the base and superstructure. And it's very synonymous with tech and society, where you have the base, which is kind of essentially the tech side, where it's capital, it's labor, it's the humans, it's factories. And then the superstructure, he says, is the values, the ideology, the mindset, and they kind of are reinforcing each other. And for him, it's like that was a big reason why capitalism is so hard to break, because you have this reinforcing loop between the base and superstructure. So this is all to say that as we're building this GameB future, we need to tell the correct stories about it. We need to create this best, we need to talk about the superstructure, and AKA the society side of the tech society loop. So that's one piece that I think is important. And then the other piece, and why kind of blockchain comes in, is we need to build the new kind of infrastructure. And so Vinay Gupta has this really good, Vinay Gupta is a Ethereum co-founder and is a very good systems thinker. And he talks about how, especially Ethereum, but just generally smart contract platforms, are really good at building what he calls metastructures. And so if you think about this new future that we're trying to build, you can think about how we exist today. And how we exist today, there's a ton of what you could call neoliberal capitalist infrastructure, which is there's a bunch.
Might have to get concrete there.
Okay, totally. Essentially, there's a bunch of infrastructure around both roads and electricity. There's a bunch of infrastructure around institutions, like nation-state governments, banks, academic institutions, whatever. These things are part of our the old world that got us where we are, and we need to, as we make this new future, we need to create new infrastructure for this new future. And when we think about creating this new infrastructure, a traditional problem that we've had is trying to create new infrastructure using the old system. Because you're like, hey, we'd like to exit this old system and build this new stuff. And you're like, oh, but how do we even fund the new stuff? Because the new stuff is operating in totally different paradigms than the old stuff. And so that's why blockchain is actually good, is because because A, at its root, it's money and it's trust. And so as we're losing trust in all these existing institutions, we can kind of create trust within the blockchain system. And people will be excited by it. We'll start funding that.
So you lose me a little bit there's the blockchain space and there's the cryptocurrency space. You seem to be using them interchangeably, and yet I don't see them interchangeably, because I think of the blockchain and the Ethereum open source stack that's used to create a lot of this stuff as a smart contracting, fully transparent, distributed infrastructure. It so happens that I think the first implementation of it that everybody's at least heard of, and even if it's their uncle at Thanksgiving dinner, start talking about Bitcoin, that it's an instance of using that technology. They're not one and the same, or do you see them the same?
I think that you could definitely claim that they are not one and the same, that blockchain, especially when people use distributed ledger technology, that generally means things that don't have cryptocurrencies attached to them and instead are just transparent, interoperable database kind of things. However, I do think the cryptocurrency piece, so if you imagine the blockchain is a series of transactions. It's from Rhys to Ryan, and from Ryan to Rhys, and those get put on this ledger, and then that series of transactions on that ledger, one of those goes onto a block, and then a bunch of those blocks together is the blockchain. So it's like a long toilet paper roll. If you imagine that, then the question is, what is on those transactions? And generally speaking, those transactions will be a cryptocurrency. So that's how they kind of interrelate. So that's why I kind of mash them into one.
Understand. Okay, so people do really talk about them. They can't really separate them.
I think that they are more together than they are separate.
So we got now into the part of, I think you'd agree that cryptocurrency, since they're more together than they are apart, it is the first concrete example of using this distributed ledger technology that's to make a new set of currencies, of which there are thousands of. Seem to be. I think 1,500 right now. Okay.
This episode is brought to you by Shapeshift.io, the world's leading trustless digital asset exchange. Quickly swap between dozens of cryptocurrencies, including Bitcoin, Ether, Dash, Bitcoin Cash, Augur, Golem, and many more. And this is not your typical crypto exchange. You don't need to create an account or share your personal information, and your funds are never stored on Shapeshift. This means that your hard-earned digital wealth is never up for grabs by hackers or other malicious actors. To get started, visit Shapeshift.io, choose the tokens you'd like to swap, input your receiving address, and send your funds. It's that easy.
Yeah. Where do you see it going in other areas, specifically when we start thinking about sustainability or humanistic systems? Those things aren't getting a lot of visibility when we talk about we start reporting on the variable price of Bitcoins and how much it goes up and down every day as it's trying to, I guess, fund your GameB. But maybe that's a different question.
We hope that all Bitcoin was meant for that purpose.
Okay, but I got distracted. But back to the sustainability and humanistic places. What are some of the concrete examples that you see emerging in those areas?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, so I think that within those areas, so specifically thinking about something like sustainability, you have, in general, there are kind of two big areas. And so if you imagine the blockchain in it is that it's a very transparent thing, and that people can look at it, and it is not owned by one entity, so it doesn't exist in a silo, kind of like Facebook's data exists in a big silo. And so one thing that it's very good at is supply chains. So that's a place where you can start mapping out an entire supply chain. And if you map out an entire supply chain on the blockchain, then you can start to determine things about it. And you can say, hey, if we look at the supply chain, it's easier than to say, hey, there's this thing called slave-free trade, which says, hey, how many slaves or which slaves or hopefully zero slaves were used to produce this good. And then you can also do a similar thing, but with like kind of carbon tracking. So you can say, hey, we're producing this thing. For example, the World Wildlife Fund has this tuna pilot that they're doing right now where they're tracking tuna from bait to plate. And they're showing with that you have these little RFID tags on the fish somehow. And they track that tuna throughout the supply chain, say, where did it come from? Was it fished illegally? Was it fished legally? How much carbon was used as it was transported? So that's some of these example things that people are trying to do within the blockchain space are supply chain transparency pieces.
Yeah, that reminds me of what Patagonia has been going through for the last 20 years. Is it's tried to trace its supply chain, find where it's got organic or non-organic cottons, and then be able to monitor that supply chain continuously. And hasn't been an easy process for them, especially when you're talking about recycled pop bottles or all kinds of things that they source to make their products. So this becomes then a way to do that more efficiently, effectively, but maybe with a lot more visibility for all as opposed to just hidden to them.
Totally. And I think that a lot of the initial stuff is just pure, hey, we are IBM and we work with a lot of companies on their supply chains and we're just going to help them be more efficient. And that'll be good in various ways, but then there's also the transparency piece, which will hopefully be good for
So is that maybe part of the transition piece is this technology gets picked up for its efficiency capacities first, but it plants an infrastructure seed that can be grown and harvested later in the form of how much carbon is it? How far did that thing travel from? Who actually caught it? Who built it? How do I get it fixed?
Exactly. And that might not be stage one, but it should be it. The infrastructure hopefully will be there. And then the other piece, which you've talked about a bit, is the carbon side of things, where you can essentially imagine tokenizing carbon, and right now the kind of carbon offset ecosystem. And so another thing that blockchain is good at is interoperability, because it's designed to be in between things rather than in silos or whatever. And so with kind of the interoperability piece, you also often get lower transaction costs for trying to then exchange these kind of carbon tokens. So hopefully you're able to understand it better. Understand the supply chain better, and then once you do that, you tokenize it, and then once you have it tokenized, then those things get exchanged more easily as well. So that's an example of that. There's a group led by this thing called Carbon X, and there's like 32 people in this blockchain carbon coalition that are looking at tokenizing carbon in various ways. I think there's a big pilot in China happening right now with it.
Maybe that last piece that's helpful for people to understand, as you said, it's an interoperability piece, and that is the notion of these smart contracts are mostly to be dealt with by computers, not by people. We're not going to sit at terminals and we're going to type some Word document and send it to the blockchain, and it's become a smart contract because we sent it to the blockchain.
Yeah, it's often computer based. It's computers talking to computers. That is one of the big things, is machine to machine talking. Yep.
And the smart contract thing is this notion of automating a supply chain. And one of the other pieces that I've heard that why it makes it so efficient is, hey, I can code up a contract that then might actually, think of buying music from somebody, that might actually, at the point at which somebody decides to listen to a certain song on top of Spotify, it then sends and distributes the payments to everybody at that point in time, as opposed to having a long delay cycle or any other accounting system. So this has huge implications on accounting white collar work.
Yes, it does. And that is one of the things that we need to be wary of, is as if you think about it in a loose form, as automation and AI automates a bunch of blue-collar jobs, that leads to a lot of job loss, that leads to a lot of political unrest. And then if you imagine blockchain doing a similar thing with white-collar jobs, and those two things kind of converging at a similar time, that could be an issue. And so that's what they call a creative destruction externality, which is the idea that when you create this new system, when we're trying to transition over to GameB in this new bottom-up world, and you have these trusted centralized institutions that have lots of power, like governments and banks and nation states and whatever, that is going to be, they're going to be creating a new system. You got to make sure that you do it as smoothly as possible. So yes, we should be.
When you think of scaffolding our way into this system, right? If we could have maybe like Kevin Kelly talks about, all technology is at least 51% good, right? But if we can scaffold our way into the answer of the good, the benevolent side, as opposed to the oppressive side of things, when you think about scaffolding your way there, it's funny listening to some of your podcasts, and especially the one about the Denver Hackathon that was just last month. The community is highly diverse, highly inclusive, altruistic in its behavior. Yep. Why is that emerging, and is that intentional in scaffolding? Yep. And who's doing that?
Yeah. So
is this all just done by a bunch of folks who are not worrying about their retirement? Is it the next generation only, or what's happening here?
So it's kind of crazy. So the easiest way to think about this, so if we think back to that tech society loop, and on the society side, these new values, this new ideology, one thing that a lot of people want is like, oh man, I just want hope for the future, and then you look at the current status quo and you're like, oh my God. And trust in all of our institutions, and all of our, in theory, trusted institutions are going down a bunch. And so when people look at that world, they're like, man, I want a new future, but I can't find it here. Where can I find it? Oh, here. And then they look at crypto and they're like, whoa. These people have this vision of the future that I can actually buy into. And so you get a bunch of people who are essentially solving that same job to be done, this goal where it's like, oh man, I want hope. I can't get hope over here. Oh, I can get hope over here, which is why crypto, both for its monetary reasons, it's spread like virally through humanity, but also for its hope reasons, it's spread virally through humanity.
So do you credit that to whom? Or to what? Yes, or to what actions? What behaviors cause that to be hope?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So I think that there's part of it is you have a bunch of people who, it's kind of this reinforcing loop between when you have abundance and you have enough, then you can essentially start to do long-term thinking. And that long-term thinking allows you then to work on these more kind of macro-systemic problems. And so I think that
more altruistic problems.
Altruistic problems,
yeah,
exactly. So you have, I think that is, and by the way, that's a great, when people talk about universal basic income, and they're like, oh man, it's just going to make everybody lazy. There's this really big study happening with Give Directly, a 26,000 person study, randomized control trial, where they are giving a bunch of UBI across 2 or 10-year time periods with these people, and their initial qualitative data from it, when you look at it, it's just like everybody's long-term thinking now. And so it's like, yes, this is so good. Back to your original question, though, I think that so you have those people who essentially have all their other basic needs met. And then once they have their basic needs met, especially once the crypto price goes up, they definitely have their basic needs met. And then they think, okay, well, how do I achieve meaning in the world? Where's that job to be done? How do I do that? And they're like, well, I got this one on Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I got this one. Well, let's go up to self-actualization. Let's make that happen, And so that involves then this kind of turning humanity into a better thing. I think that those kinds of, I think the I think that the job to be done of hope plus the abundance mindset and that allowing people to go higher up on Maslow's hierarchy of needs kind of created this new crypto world that is more for good. Yeah.
I wonder, and I don't know, as I've taught you a little bit before, I've been on the search for how you create, as I've described, citizen engineers. And a buddy of mine, Dave Douglas, wrote the book called Citizen Engineers, and open source was a primary component in it because it produced a lot for the commons, as well as allowed it to get used a lot in the industrial section. But when I spent a lot of time working on that with and researching and talking to engineers all over the place, including professors at the university here at Colorado, the thing I got stuck on was empathy. And that was the notion that it's hard to think in the long term, and it's hard to think altruistically if your empathy bubble is not very big in time or space. And that comes from living in an insular life, in one where you're trapped in a loop like poverty, or trapped in an echo chamber with only the people. I wonder if there's an empathy component in here, and this is me just listening to the podcasts of ETHDenver, the hackathon, and saying it was an amazingly inclusive and diverse group there, and there was a lot of creative collisions. Were they intentional?
So 2 points. One is on the point of empathy. If you look at that cause selection sheet that I talked about before, if you think about the other problems there are things like global health, global poverty, and then animal. There's tens of factory farming. There's tens of billions of animals killed in bad ways every year, and so depending on how you weight those, that can go higher up. And so if those are all empathy problems, where people they don't have the abstract empathy to think about the cow or to think about the poor person in another part of the world. So that is another big problem that we need to solve, in addition to the game theory problems, is a world in which and especially where we have the ability to do so with stuff like social media. Right now it's being used for the reverse reason, unfortunately, because that isn't aligned with their business models. But hopefully in the future we will be able to align these social media business models more with empathy. So that was the first point. And then on your second point of how ETHDenver did it specifically, I mean, we were very intentional with our pushing for diversity, and then we were also pretty intentional with just creating spaces where people could do bottom-up stuff themselves. So we just for example, there was this weird art thing that happened where there were people on the roof that were doing this art thing, and they were doing their art where they're connecting it to the blockchain in various ways. And I had a friend who works at another blockchain company who's this guy Brady, and I knew he was a music dude. And I was like, dude, Brady, you should do this thing or whatever. I had no idea what he was going to do. He brought a ton of equipment. He started doing this crazy looping VR stuff up there. I had I didn't do any of that, but if you create a safe space for people to do it, then they will express themselves in the way that they are authentically themselves. So I think that was beautiful.
Given where we're at on time, I know we want to take a couple questions from people in the audience. I want to say thank you. I really appreciate everything you're doing locally and obviously nationally and maybe internationally for the world, and trying to create GameB and living that way yourself right now. It was really helpful for us to be able to share that with the group as we're trying to imagine how to solve one of those empathetic problems associated with climate change, and realize that it is a problem closely nestled to a lot of other problems in a very complex system that when you start playing around with it, things move on you. So super helpful. I know you had a couple other questions that you wanted to ask before.
Well, I think that I guess two things. One is, and we'll do even a little quiz with the crowd right now. Guess so I've been a vegetarian for 10 years, okay, for the reason of climate change, because I read the book Eating Animals, and I read about the climate change. I was like, oh my God, I should be a vegetarian. So I've been a vegetarian or a reducitarian for 10 years. Guess how many dollars you could pay to an organization in order to offset those the carbon costs.
Of eating meat, or
of eating meat?
Okay, so if you weren't a vegetarian but you were a carnivore, and you said I wanted to have the same carbon footprint as a person who was a vegetarian, what would my rec cost be for a flight that I took?
Exactly. So who thinks it's between $1 and $10? Who thinks it's between $10 and $100? Who thinks between $100 and $1,000?
This is for a year or for how long?
This for a year.
For a year.
Yep, a year. Oh, sorry, no, a year. Who thinks between $1,000 and $10,000? Okay, sweet. So it's $1.34.
Is it really?
Yep, which is crazy, and that's why this effective altruist perspective is very helpful, because they have they've essentially looked at a bunch of different carbon offsetting things, and there's this one called Cool Earth, which is 25x more effective because it works with land use and giving farmers the ability to use their land for other reasons rather than clear cutting the land, and so. It's $1.34, and I learned that, and I was just like, I could have paid $10, like the amount. That is so sad. I hear people in the crowd being amazed by that, but we can look at it later. So
wow, it seems very surprising.
It's surprising. It's surprising. Yeah, I think that that was the reason why I thought of that is because it's in this piece of when you start to do self-imposed income taxes. One of the things that you try to do is essentially internalize all your externalities. And so a way that you do that, a simple way to do that within the climate change world is to say, okay, if I eat meat, I'm going to pay $1.34 a year. How many flights do I take? It's about $1 a flight essentially to carbon offset it. Okay, so I'm going to offset all those flights. So you can essentially add up, and it's usually $40 or whatever a year to do that work.
To get yourself to, as the Zero Impact Man book from the guy who tried to do it in New York City tells the story of getting himself close to carbon zero, you could do it for $40 a year.
Yep, exactly. So that is a fun little tip. And then the other thing that this is related to from the talking about a final key piece here, and just a thing for the listeners at home or whatever, is the way in which I'm kind of. So if you think about, someone like Gandhi said, be the change you want to see in the world. And I'm trying to do that with respect to GameB. And the way that I'm doing that is essentially by having so the things that you want are I'm trying to exist purely in the commons. And what that means is that I don't exist within a given company. So I don't exist within a given silo, but rather I exist within the commons and have a bunch of different people kind of pay me. So I am peer funded by both a lot of people and a lot of companies in order to be in the commons. And then another key thing that we're trying to transition to is the abundant mindset, the we have enough mindset. And so that is another thing here where I exist. I essentially make my money through Patreon, which is kind of like Kickstarter, but for subscriptions, where you give people a certain amount of dollars per month to do their thing. It's usually used for like musicians or whatever. And I'm through Patreon, and then this version of Patreon called StakeTree, which is an Ethereum-based Patreon, essentially. And with both of those, the people who are paying me, who are supporting me because they have that abundant mindset. So I'm essentially telling people, look, not only do I have the abundant mindset and I have my own self-imposed income taxes, but you should do this yourself as well, and you should support the commons, and you have enough, and you have all these things. And so it's trying to create essentially a virally propagating bottom-up peer-to-peer funding system that accounts for the commons. That's what I'm trying to do.
That's creating the future today.
That's me trying to live the future today. Yeah. So if you want to support me on Patreon or StakeTree, you can go to staketree.com/Rhys Lindmark and support. So I think that's another kind of crucial piece here.
Yeah. Neat.
Cool. Should we open up for Q&A?
Absolutely.
Okay. Let's. And you can talk into this if you want to. Honestly.
Okay. On back to your $40 a year to offset your entire. I'm completely confounded by that because obviously those costs, those prices, don't begin to reflect true incorporation of externalities. So I'm a bit confused. $1 to offset a flight is, the fundamental human foible in human contribution to climate change is that we have so mispriced fossil fuel consumption for their true costs. So could you explain how that works, please?
Yeah. So I'll first state that I think that's a good question. Also, you're the sustainability director of the school, so there's a not a non-zero chance that you know more than I do. So here's the numbers that I know. If you, through this thing Cool Earth, and I can send you the link afterwards, it's a very long article looking at when you pay money to Cool Earth, which is a nonprofit, and then from the money that you pay them, how much forest, essentially rainforest, do they protect per dollar, and then how much of that per dollar cost, then how much rainforest then accounts for essentially a carbon offset. So, or one carbon ton equivalent. And so the numbers that I know are it's $1.34 for 1 metric ton of carbon CO2 equivalent. That's the number that I know. I also know it's 25x better than the next best one.
That's where the big thing is coming. Because most of us, when we think about RECs, if you looked like on the United page or the Delta page, and you looked at offsetting a flight, it would be in the neighborhood of about $20.
Yeah, exactly.
But what you're saying is this Cool Earth group, who's paying farmers to use the rainforest land
in a different way,
so that it doesn't get plowed up, is 25 more times effective than most carbon offsetting things. So that may be where we're getting a little off in that math.
Yeah, I think it's that, and I think the other thing that a lot of people have the wrong mindset around or the wrong data around is, for me personally, I had this too, which is that I didn't think that essentially it's like one transatlantic flight is equal to a year of vegetarianism, and I was like, oh man, so learning. And you could say, oh man, either way. But so I think that's the other crucial thing, is ordering of magnitudes, the different kinds of ways that people try to carbon offset. Does that answer your question? Okay, sweet. Are there other questions? Corey?
Yeah. Rhys, how do you deal with, so like you've been vegetarian for 10 years, you are a vehement, but not actually vehement, effective altruist, and you're around, people who aren't vegetarian, and you're eating, you're watching other people eat what they eat, and you know what impact it has, and you know also what impact they could have if they took 1 or 10% of their income and did all these things. How do you how do you calm your soul from not getting so cynical and jaded and and want to outlash being in that environment?
That is a good question, one that I get a lot as well, which is when you are a person, because it's from a pure game theory perspective, I'm essentially decentralizing power away from me. I'm reducing my own happiness to some extent. I'm doing these things, and the rest of the world isn't. It's like, oh man, that's sad. And don't I get angry at them or whatever? I think that for me, I'm not really an angry person, and it's a kind of a curiosity piece, I think, is honestly what it is. And so, for example, when Trump was on his rise in 2016, a bunch of people were essentially demonizing the right. A bunch of people on my Facebook and what have you, and I was like, wait a second, these people are people too, and they grew up in some context, and they've had a bunch of random stuff, and we shouldn't be hating on them like this, maybe we should. And so I reached out to a bunch of various random Trump supporters and started to try to have conversations with them, and it generally failed in various ways, but and I think that there's this intense, I think for me personally, it is this understanding. I think the other piece is, so if you think about from the Trump perspective, there's this really great piece in the New Yorker about this lady in the Westboro Baptist Church who was, which is a really intense. They picket funerals funerals there. They kill the Jews, all these kinds of things. It's a very small community, very kind of culty, and this lady was in it. And she was all angry against the world and was mean to various people. And then, but over the course of a couple years, this very patient rabbi and this very patient person that she played Words with Friends with, they were just very patient with her and asked her questions, very curious. And over time, she actually cut all of the ties that she ever knew and left the church. And that is the most extreme example of this. And it's just it was quote unquote solved by lots of patience and time. And so there was this lady who was in a context, and she was operating within a context. For me personally, I know that in high school, I used to say oh, that's gay and things like that a bunch. And so I was just operating in a context, And so for me, also knowing that I was operating in that context and had various incentive sets and social incentive sets and those kinds of things makes me that when I think about today and I think about all the other people in the world who are both on the don't agree with me politically spectrum and all the people in the world who aren't doing the things that I'm doing. I just think, hey, you've had a totally different life than I've had, and I want to be curious about that, and then eventually, hopefully, I'll be patient with you, and maybe you'll see what I see, or maybe I'm being wrong, you know? So I think that's the how I do it. Curiosity plus understanding context. Cool. Any other questions?
Thank you for the conversation. Rhys, you mentioned that one of the issues with creating these new infrastructures and technologies that are more next-level systems, GameB, is that we're creating them from a Game A place. So my question to you is, what does creating from a Game B place look like? What do we need to embody?
Is your question about how we create Game B systems with Game A funding, or is that your question?
I guess it's how do we create it from, like, what are the values? Like, if you look at the system, take a systems thinking point of view, and you look at the iceberg model, the systems that we create come from the mindsets and the mental models. So what do we need to embody in terms of the mental models and the underlying values and beliefs that we have in order to then create the Game B systems?
I'll answer part of that because it's a tie into your other question, but maybe it's also a lead into where you're going to go, and that was so that's real specific to what we've been doing in TheoryU, right? There's a model in TheoryU that has at the top an iceberg. Iceberg is the symptoms, the problems that we see in the world today. The level below that is a set of patterns of behavior that happen. There's structures that create those patterns of behaviors, systemic structures, and that all emanates from a mindset, right? And the three areas that we've spent a lot of time talking about in TheoryU are a crisis in the disconnect between myself and nature, myself and others, back to empathy, and myself and myself. And that is not knowing myself. And when I think about the place that to answer your question from before of operating, you need to operate from a place of self-love, the connection of yourself to yourself that allows you to be insulated from the problems of how somebody else is behaving in a different way. It's not about someone else. It's about me behaving in the way I want to see the world. And that's really all that matters. And I can only be that on myself. I can't make other people responsible. I can only be that person. I mean, whether you're talking Gandhi or talking Martin Luther King, that really emanates to me. I don't know if that leads you to ETHCommons, which is, I think, a beginning of a picture that says, how do I instantiate blockchain-based systems in a way that internalize externalities? But that's what I think about it as.
Well, I think that what you're saying is definitely connected to both of those questions, which is, and it's that self piece that we were talking about at the beginning, where, you gotta have the self-love in order to do anything in the world, and you gotta know that we're all individual actors, and you can't make anybody, like in nonviolent communication, there's this thing where it's like the other people are responsible for their own feelings, so if you said something and then it's like, sorry homie, like that was you were the one who felt sad, like I didn't make you sad. So I think that is a crucial concept. And I think going to your question is, I think that there's from a pure mindset perspective, my instinct is to answer the same way that I would answer before, which is this non-accumulation mindset, and this abundant mindset is the one that allows us to begin to see a world that is a win-win world, to then see a world where we actively don't need to accumulate things for ourselves, but can actively self-tax yourself and essentially go higher up on Maslow's hierarchy of needs. It's a win-win because you're going higher up on Maslow's hierarchy of needs as you're helping other people's basic needs through something like the give directly thing or whatever. I think that my instinct is that the crucial mindset is a non-accumulation, abundant, win-win mindset, probably coupled with a little bit of omni-consideration or what have you, where you have that empathy piece where you say, look, even though essentially the abstract empathy to say whether they're an animal or an AI or a poor person somewhere, that they deserve to move up Maslow's hierarchy of needs too. Before we go to you, does that answer your question? It does. Okay, sweet, cool.
Yeah, I want to say something about that specifically because we are the genetic descendants of the win-lose paradigm winners. And so built into our genetics as a result of epigenetics is this win at all costs mentality, which is really the only reason that we're here right now. Because if our ancestors hadn't had that, we wouldn't be here. So we are the winners of that. So it's really up to us, and Rhys, I see you as such a beautiful example of it, and we really need more models. Mm-hmm. And so I hope that as many people as possible can hear you and see you, because what we need is the models that show us how to do it and show us that we can do it without ending up living in the park. Right? Because that's I know that for me as a woman, that's bred into my system, this belief that I'm going to end up a homeless bag lady if I don't engage in these win-lose dynamics, specifically also having to do with masculine feminine dynamics and some other things that we're moving through right now. And so we need both elders who model it for us and, obviously you're not an elder in the age sense, and yet here you are operating in many ways as an elder. And we need to be able to develop our own consciousness to the degree where we can see where the win-lose dynamics are operating within us so that we can consciously make a different choice. There's a new article out just recently by a guy named Mark Manson, Grow the F Up, or How to Grow the F Up. And, it's really laying out that as adults, we do the right thing because it's the right thing, not to get something. Very few of us have ever been initiated into adulthood, hence why we're doing what we're doing at Star House, so that we can become adults. And thank you for being an adult, Rhys.
And I just agree with everything, so much of what you said there. And two quick points on it is, one is, so we are definitely the winners of this win-lose game. And you can imagine for me, I grew up as a rich white male in America, whoa, straight, name all things. I got them. Yeah, exactly. Oh, sweet. They're awesome. Thank you, by the way. Yes, thank you. But the thing that's crazy with this, and what you're talking about, Ali, with what you're talking about with this, the fear of becoming the bag lady in the park. I, at the end of last year, had a very intense scarcity mindset. So the scarcity mindset is brutal, by the way, and that's what so many people are in, and that's what you're releasing them from when you give them things like a UBI. I had 2 months of runway, 1 or 2 months of runway, but even if it was bad, people will ask me about this, and it's look, I am a coder. I can code for whatever, how many, $50, $100 an hour. If that doesn't work, then, even I can talk to my parents and they would, whatever, they can do whatever they need to. So for me, and someone like Mark Zuckerberg has talked about this, where the ability to take risks is part of, I essentially feel like I have a UBI now. Because if you think about the chain, it's at the very back of it, I got my parents. And above that, I could ask anybody in the crypto blockchain systems thinking whatever world, effective altruist world, and they'd be like, oh, you need money right now because you've been trying your best? Have some money, So I feel, and that is these kind of deep web of trust that I think we're starting to create. I agree with you, I guess. Should we wrap up?
I have to run.
Leave, yeah.
But you can say I think we have the room for another 15 minutes.
Okay, well, let's all thank Ryan for coming and being separate. And just are there any final questions, I guess, is the...
Thank you guys for being our live audience. It was way more fun to have interaction than to record it in a studio staring at each other's face. For sure. God forbid. Yeah.